The brain is predicting how it thinks you're going to think, feel, or behave in these moments. In other words, a lot of times we get overwhelmed by our minds because we let the minds rule us, when the brain is a recording of everything we've ever shown it. An identity is something that we construct for ourselves, that it's how we view ourselves. Personality is how other people see us. Identity is how we view ourselves. How do you want to live the rest of your life? What are your values going to be? What are your strengths? What are your character traits? What are your belief systems about yourself and the world around you? We start to see the beneficial results of acting and thinking and feeling that way. And because it's in alignment with who we truly want to be inside, it doesn't have any mental friction attached to it because we're finally being the person that we're meant to be.
You're listening to Brainwork Framework, a business and marketing podcast, brought to you by focus-biz.com.
Welcome back to another episode. With us today is a brain science educator and coach who helps growth-oriented professionals level up their brain performance through education and insights in cutting-edge brain science. So excited to have him on today. George Haymaker, how are you doing today?
Great, Chris. Great to be on, and hello, everyone.
We always like to ask our entrepreneurs, tell us about your journey. What were you doing before that kind of led you into this journey of education and brain science?
Oh boy, you have a minute?
Just a couple. Yeah, we got time.
All right. Well, it's a bit of a story. I didn't graduate from college thinking I would go into brain science. It happened through the circuitous route of life. I was an entrepreneur for many years. I decided at the age of 30 that I just didn't like to work for people. I decided that autonomy was one of my most important psychological needs, and I wanted to serve that. I went to work starting, founding, building, leading. I think it's been 5 or 6 different businesses now over the next 3.5 decades. All different types of businesses in telecom and manufacturing and metals distribution and restaurants and ice cream brands, a variety of different industries and types of services and products and businesses. That's been pretty varied. But along the way, I was struggling mentally. I grew up in an environment that was privileged in many ways and yet unsettling in others psychologically. My parents were successful, and we probably moved 35 times in my life. I was always in and out of new and different schools, having to say goodbye to friends, meet new friends. I was heavily disciplined as a kid. I would get disciplined physically, and that only made my psychology a little more challenging and unsettled. There was some other types of abuse that happened at a younger age. So I was uncomfortable in my own skin, struggling for self-esteem. I had self-doubt. I was highly emotionally reactive, tons of anxiety. I also had a lot of addiction in my family, and my entire mom's side of my family were addicts. So I had that in my genes. And when it got expressed through the stress I went through as a child. And when I got to college, I found drugs and alcohol and find that as the solution for all of my mental discomfort. I used that as a solution for much of my adult life as I was struggling mentally. Even though I was highly functioning and performing well in business, I was struggling underneath the covers, so to speak. And I would binge and use drugs and alcohol in various degrees over the years while I was working these entrepreneurial ventures and use that as a solution to cope with mental discomfort. The problem is that addiction only heads one direction and it heads no place good. Finally, I became addicted to drugs and alcohol. I had no more control over whether I was going to use them or not. I needed to use them. It was part of my addictive pattern, and it got really bad. And in my early 50s, I was taking 50 pain pills a day and drinking 2 bottles of vodka, and it just got super ugly. My wife had left me. My dogs had left me. You're in trouble when your dogs leave you. And I found myself in rehab and started a process of hitting hard bottom. Lots of consequences had built up. And at that point, it's either die or try to figure out a new way. And that's what I was left with, this need and desire. I summoned the wherewithal, the inner strength to try something new and different, because clearly everything I had tried to that point was not working. It had led me to a hard bottom. So I entered 12-step program, AA, but I also became very curious about why my brain had become addicted, why I was so uncomfortable in my mind, and I just wanted to know the whys, wheres, and how, and all of that, because I'm a curious kind of individual. And it helps me to understand. It's one thing for somebody to tell me what to do, it's another thing for me to understand it and actually take ownership and be empowered by it. And that's what led me down this journey of self discovery and research and education. I read a bunch of books on psychology and spirituality, and it took me to the brain, neuroscience, because all of this is formulated in the brain. It turns out, as I was learning, that the brain is really magical. It can create patterns, but it also can create new ones. So we're not stuck with who we are. The brain has what's called neuroplasticity, which its ability to change, adapt, and evolve. It can modify itself based on something different that we want to be. Use this information to transform myself and rewire my own brain. And the results were so meaningful to me and so transformative that when I was looking for the next thing to do a few years ago, I said, why would I keep this to myself? It's been the most important, impactful thing of my life. I'll bet you other people are going through similar things, whether they're addicts or not, they could still be struggling. Why don't I take all this and see if other people might find it valuable? That's when I went and took a bunch of graduate level coursework in neuroscience. I got certified in coaching. And now what I do is take people inside their own brains to understand how they work and understand how influential they can be in their own mental brain performance, their own mental outcomes, and how they are today does not have to be how they are forever.
And I appreciate you sharing that journey with us because it's not comfortable for us to share something that just makes us so vulnerable, but it really shares both what other people are struggling with and what they can overcome simply by empowering themselves and just reworking their brains here. There are people that I even think of in my mind that could benefit from something like this, whether myself, because we all have struggles of focusing. Either it's brain fog or we're just lack confidence. And so many people struggle with this. So the fact that you're working out there to improve it, we appreciate that. Tell me more about the process and how does the brain science work that allowed you to overcome everything that you've done? How can it help others?
The first thing to understand is the brain, how it is today, because of all the thoughts, feelings, and emotions and experiences that we've ever had in our life. It's really just a filing cabinet or a hard drive of all of our experiences that we've ever had. And the more that we practice those experiences or re engage in them or reiterate them, the stronger those patterns become. It's almost like you could save a document once in your hard drive, but then if that document kept reappearing over and over again and you kept saving it because you kept engaging in it, let's call it an unhelpful pattern, whether it's lack of confidence or multitasking or procrastination, these are all patterns that your brain practices. And the more times it practices them, the stronger and more ingrained that they get. That's why these things develop and they keep reappearing and we keep re-engaging in them is because the brain has saved them. And when you encounter new situations, the brain keeps bringing those forward to you as an option for you to re-engage in again. They're called predictions. The brain is predicting how it thinks you're going to think, feel, or behave in these moments. And because these are the memories that you saved, they're the ones that the brain keeps bringing forward. That's why we get stuck or struggle with the same things over and over again, is because of that dynamic. So, what we have to do then is a process of analyzing those patterns, understanding how they developed, when they developed, and usually these things trace back to a lot of times our childhood when we're forming our brains. And we analyze what the root causes of them are. So, why did they develop and why do they keep perpetuating today? And then, just by virtue of having that understanding of them, it almost allows you to separate from them and look at them objectively. In other words, a lot of times we get overwhelmed by our minds because we let the minds rule us when the brain is a recording of everything we've ever shown it. And we deconstruct these patterns, look at them objectively, and then we try to loosen the grip that they have on us. We look at evidence as the fact that they maybe started years ago Why aren't they helpful anymore? And what are they costing us today to continue to re-engage in them? If a friend of yours was going through similar things, what would you tell them about these patterns? So, what we try to do is look at them, all the costs associated with them, why they're not true anymore, and how we might coach somebody else who's a friend of ours. If they had these patterns, what would we tell them to do? This begins to loosen the grip that these patterns have on us and open windows for the brain to consider new possibilities and new ways of being. And then what we do is we construct new patterns that align with a preferred identity. An identity is something that we construct for ourselves, that it's how we view ourselves. Personality is how other people see us, identity is how we view ourselves. So when we struggle with confidence or struggle with these other things that are holding us back, these become part of our identity. But they're not part of our preferred identity, the one that we want to have for ourselves. We basically draw up and construct, and this is part of the work I do with people. What is your preferred identity? How do you want to live the rest of your life? What are your values going to be? What are your strengths? What are your character traits? What are your belief systems about yourself and the world around you? How do you want to think, feel, and act? And we basically create this character. It's very much like an actor getting a new script from a director saying, here's your character for this movie. And you have to go rehearse and learn that character and learn everything about them, how they think, how they feel, how they act, so that you can actually become that character. So what we do is we design this new preferred individual with a new identity, and then we actually start to rehearse that person. And then as we experience that person, we are experiencing the reward that comes from being more in alignment with this person. And all of a sudden, our mental friction starts to go down because we're acting confidently, even though we might be going through the motions for a little while. We start to see the beneficial results of acting and thinking and feeling that way. And because it's in alignment with who we truly want to be inside, it doesn't have any mental friction attached to it because we're finally being the person that we're meant to be. And that all goes away and we start to feel better about ourselves. When we start to feel better about ourselves, the brain gets rewarded by that. We get these goosebumps, we get these surges of neurotransmitters. They're neurochemicals that are feel good chemicals, things like dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, oxytocin. Whenever we feel good about anything, these are the chemicals that are surging through us. And this process is lots of repetition and lots of reward. And as we experience our old self gets triggered, we catch it, we look at it objectively, and we don't engage in it because every time we engage in an old pattern, it reinforces that. We want to stay on this side of the fence and keep reinforcing our new patterns, our new identity, this new character of ourselves. And it's a process that takes time. It takes diligence, commitment, and motivation and willpower at the beginning, but it gets easier and easier as the brain begins to understand that it's safe, that it's rewarding, and that it's actually more beneficial than the old way of being.
Wow, all of this is so fascinating to me, just trying to understand how the brain works and the fact that it can accomplish so much. It can be our best friend or our worst enemy in a sense. And I've always been curious about what do we have as instinct versus a learned behavior? It almost seems like our instincts are the learned behavior of whether our past or the generations in the past. So it's fascinating to understand that we could even rewire the way that we think. Those options could be different options if we allowed ourselves to think about what is a bad option to us and what could be good, and then start practicing that learned behavior so that way we're becoming the person that we want to be and not that old person that we were.
Exactly. It's important to remember that the brain is a follower, it's a record keeping device. These thoughts and emotions and patterns and behaviors that emerge into our minds from our brains, they're simply regurgitations of what we've practiced in the past. And so when we look at that, it's like, okay, it's not the truth. We don't have to believe it or we don't have to engage in it and repetition it again. It's just simply presented to us by the brain as a prediction for how we should think, feel, and behave in this moment because that's all it knows. That's how we've trained it in the past. If you had a dog and you trained it to bark and the barking is no longer helpful because it's driving you nuts, then you can train your dog to not bark by training it and treating it, giving it reward when it doesn't bark. Then it will begin to reorient its behavior around what is going to give it reward or the treat in the future. It's very similar. The brain is more than willing to change, adapt, and evolve. And what I mean by that neurologically and physiologically is that the brain is made up of 85 billion neurons, which are the brain cells, and they string together in patterns across a string, could go from one part of the brain to another part of the brain. All the different aspects of your brain that are involved in a single function are strung together. These neurons are strung together. And the more times we engage in that pattern, they light up every time we engage in it. And it lights up through electrical and chemical signaling. And if you had an MRI, you would actually see that pathway, which is a string of neurons, light up like a Christmas tree light. If that pattern is not helpful, we cannot light up that pattern anymore. If a pattern will appear in our minds from our brain because it's experienced it before and it's bringing it to our mind as an option for us to consider, we can't engage in it. Otherwise, we will put more electrical and chemical signaling through it, putting water and fertilizer on a plant. So when you put water and fertilizer on a plant, guess what? The plant gets bigger and stronger, and we don't want that. That's why we stop engaging in these patterns that are unhelpful, because we don't want to make them any stronger and any more ingrained. We've already done enough of that. When we construct new and different patterns that represent who we really want to be, that's what we have to water and fertilize. By virtue of that, these neurons that have formed these patterns that are unhelpful begin to weaken. They're not getting any more electrical or chemical signaling, no more fertilizer. They don't think that they're useful anymore. The brain begins to look at these because they haven't fired or wired together in so long, because we're not engaging in that anymore. The connection between these neurons begins to break down and it begins to weaken. And these neurons can actually break apart from the pathway and drift around, and they'll form a new pathway. They're now open to forming a new pattern. Then when we enact and create new patterns that are more helpful, that represent this new person that we want to be, these neurons will then break apart from the old pattern and move and form a new one. So that's what actually happens in these neurons. And that's why our brains are changing every day based on the new experiences that we experience and the new memories that we have and all of that, or the new habits that we're trying to create. These neurons are actually moving and shifting around. So think of your brain as like this roadmap for Rand McNally. If you look at a roadmap of the United States with all the roads and rivers and bridges and everything, everybody's brain looks different because we've all had different experiences. Our neurons are all mapped differently. But you can actually shift that map around and make it look different if you start engaging in new and different activities and practices that represent a different way of being.
Wow. I'm going to have more brain related questions here in a moment, but I wanted to ask what the process is working with you. What does it take for someone to either get started or sign up with you? And tell me what that process is like.
I'm on a lot of social media, as you might imagine. LinkedIn is a main one. My name is George Haymaker, and it's spelled like it sounds. You'll find me on LinkedIn. You'll find me on Facebook. I do a lot of short video instructional things on YouTube. I do a podcast, Train Your Brain, Master Your Mind. I have a website, georgehaymaker.com. And actually, there's a link for a free discovery call where we can chat and talk about what's going on with you and see if we're a fit to work together. But I'm telling you, this brain science stuff is real and it works for everyone. Everybody's brain is capable. And if you've ever heard that change isn't possible or a tiger doesn't change his stripes, it's not because they can't, it's because they won't, or they haven't tried, or they don't understand how.
It's so fascinating. And we'll have those links available down in the show notes and the description so everyone can get connected here. I wanted to ask about a brain science question as it relates to positivity, hope, and inspiration. There was a study done where they had placed rats into water, and without any intervention, the rats lasted maybe 10 minutes in the water. But if you lifted them up at any time and saved them, that had retrained them. And the next time that they went into the water, they stayed within the water afloat for 60 hours. So there was that inspiration, that hope and positivity that somehow there's light at the end of the tunnel. I might be saved. Is there anything that we can learn from that study that applies to how the way that our brains work when it comes to positivity, inspiration, and hope?
Yeah, well, the first thing is the brain's number one job is to keep us safe and alive and manage resources, to conserve resources in the interest of keeping us safe and alive. The brain doesn't care if you get a bigger car or a bigger house, a nicer car, have nicer clothes. All it cares about is, can I keep you safe? Can I keep you in survival so that you can have babies and continue on with the species? And that wiring goes back a few 100,000 years, the evolution of humans. To your example, if those mice would have been under big time threat, their lives would have been threatened. When you show them how to survive, that there is a way to survive and be safe, it's going to learn there's nothing more important to the brain than that. So the brain will immediately store that information, ways of surviving situations that are threatening that it's learned about, like at the very top of the list. Nothing is more salient to the brain than avoiding threats and keeping us safe and in survival. And the other component of that is, once something is learned, it does store in memory and is there for retrieval when circumstances are presented to it. For your concepts around hope and inspiration, the more times that we remember, the brain is highly trainable. But when you practice hope and inspiration, you develop neural pathways around that, patterns, versus practicing dread and self defeat. It'll learn those pathways, good and bad, depending on what you practice. So, really important to remember that what you train, what you engage in, what you think, feel, and act, it gets recorded in this hard drive of ours called the brain. And when you hit these moments that we call upon either hope or inspiration or dread, self defeat, whatever you've practiced in those situations will be what the brain pulls forward and presents to you as the best solution. And so that's why positive thinking and all the things that are helpful to you are really important to practice so that your brain will go get those previous concepts and bring them forward in moments that you really need them.
I love that. And speaking of building off of that and the learned behaviors towards positive or negative, do you feel like our social circle, our friends and our family have a direct impact on some of our behaviors and learned behaviors?
Yeah, very much so. One of the things that are hardwired into our brain, and one of the six core psychological needs that we all have as human beings, is togetherness. We are social creatures, and we're meant to live in tribes. And the reason for that is because back in the old days, when we were cavemen and there were threats all around us in the form of dinosaurs, we learned that if we banded together and operated in tribes, we stand at a better chance of surviving than if we didn't. The dinosaurs would pick us off if we were by ourselves or alone. And that's also why we're given neurochemicals, why our brain fires feel good chemicals when we're in love, when we're mating, when we have great friends. That's why it feels good, is because we're meant to have those associations because it helps us survive and it's how we're wired. So clearly, then in those relationships, we are going to be affected by those interactions. But the other thing I also want to say about that is then if we understand how the brain works, then we're not only understanding how our brain works, but we're understanding how other people's works. It helps us avoid conflict because if somebody is acting in a certain way, by virtue of our understanding of the brain, be able to then look at that situation differently than just feeling confronted or attacked by it. we might feel empathy for that individual, for that brain, and say, what is this person? This is what they may be going through. Then over time, you stop interacting with people and you start interacting with their brains. It's like brain to brain. Brain knowledge is just so important for every aspect of life because, again, it's not fixed. It is so adaptable and broad and varied in terms of its outcomes that we have the ability to cultivate and make differences in it the same way we do in our body. Here's a great analogy. We all know the difference of what being in the best shape of our life ever felt like, and we know what it felt like to be in the worst shape of our lives. And there's a huge range of outcomes in between those two extremes. That's the same range of outcomes that are available in our brains. So the question becomes, where in that range are we right now with our brain performance? Are we in the best shape we've ever been? Are we in the worst shape? And do we even know how to move it from where we are to the best shape? And that's what I help people do, help them with the information, the knowledge, and the tools to begin to improve and affect their brain performance and mental outcomes by themselves because they're now aware of how all this works.
I love that. Now, are there any common misconceptions within the field of neuroscience, brain science? I guess either commonly held beliefs that were shattered later or we discovered new information that just led us down a different path about brain science?
Well, I guess the thing that comes to mind is there's all different types of coaching and therapy out there, different approaches. You can find gurus everywhere. What I will tell you is that if whoever you're working with, whatever doctrine you follow, advice you get, individual you work with, if what they're doing does not cause those neurons to shift into a new and different pattern, at least the ones that are unhelpful that you're trying to change, if the methodologies that they're using and the tools they're giving you are not causing that change, then it's like putting a band-aid on something. Because sure enough, if the brain doesn't have a new record, concept, or memory in which to bring forward into your mind, then it's going to keep bringing the old ones. If you don't practice and repeat and develop new habits, all of which involve reward and emotional engagement in something new and different, and do it long enough to where the brains go to, then you are simply not going to transform and change in a long-lasting, sustainable way. That is for sure. That is neuroscience. That's the thing I would ask everybody to question is, what I'm doing, is it going to cause long-lasting, sustainable change by disengaging old unhelpful patterns and causing new patterns to neurologically form, developing new neural pathways where I can then count on this reoccurring and being presented to my mind in place of the old patterns. That's really the acid test of whether or not, what you're doing is working.
Everyone has to reach out to George Haymaker, the expert on neuroscience and the educator and coach. Wanted to ask George one more question before we sign off here. What are you excited for most in 2025? Do you have any new products, new things that you're launching or kind of building or working towards? Or are you maintaining everything that you've been working on already?
Thanks for asking. I'm actually starting a new group coaching program called the Brain Club. And it's a subscription based, a modest amount to join this club. And it's on a platform that allows us to all engage together and collaborate. It's made up of growth-minded professionals, but anyone that's interested in their brains and how they could take control of this marvelous capability that we have and improve it. Within that club, we'll do weekly Zoom calls, which will be full of education and Q&A and applying it to our lives. There will be weekly articles sent out, newsletters, membership modules, training modules, very similar to go into the gym. I actually call this the Brain Club, a gym membership for your brain. We all know what gym memberships are for our bodies, but this is a gym membership for your brain. It trains you to be able to learn more about how your brain works and then take control of it the same way you've done with your bodies. It gives you that same level of control and empowerment over your brain as you have your body. That's going to be coming out shortly. And I think I'll share the link on how to become involved in with you, Chris, and you can share it with the audience.
That is wonderful. Looking forward to it. Make sure you get connected. We'll have the links available down in the show notes and description here for everyone. Thank you, George, for coming on the show and sharing all this fascinating information about how our brain works, how we can retrain it, and just the future potential that we could be capable of if we simply understand how it works and how we can make those changes.
You bet, Chris. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you.